Good evening and welcome to the Center for Jewish History. This event is in connection with the exhibit Jews in Space, Members of the Tribe in Orbit, created by the Center for Jewish History and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. If you haven't seen it yet, please look just outside to the right of the auditorium, and you'll get to see all sorts of interesting artifacts. Just very briefly, the way that the exhibit came to be, and I think that for a historical research institute, an exhibit called Jews in Space is somewhat unusual. The idea came about when a center librarian and my co-curator, Melanie Myers, came to me one day and said, my husband and I were talking, and he said, you should do an exhibit on Jews in science fiction. And at the time, I was curating. Incidentally, my name is Eddie Portney. I'm YIVO's curator of exhibitions. I was curating an exhibit on rare rabbinical materials from a collection from Vilna. And what I found was there were a fair number of books in Hebrew by rabbis on astronomy. And so when Melanie suggested we do an exhibit on science fiction, I thought, we could really do something on Jews in space. There are all kinds of aspects related to it. So when you see our exhibit outside, you'll see these rare rabbinical materials on astronomy. You'll see materials connected to Jews in popular culture, science fiction, and materials loaned very graciously by astronaut Jeffrey Hoffman, materials that he took into space on the Space Shuttle. And it's really my pleasure to introduce our speakers this evening. First, Jeffrey Alan Hoffman, PhD, was NASA's first Jewish male astronaut and has been to space 5 times. A professor of aeronautics and astronautics at MIT, his space missions have included repairing the Hubble Space Telescope in 1993 when the orbiting telescope's flawed optical system was corrected. That's got to be an amazing thing to have in your resume. Over the course of his 5 missions, he has logged more than 1,211 hours and 21.5 million miles in space. Born in Brooklyn, Hoffman received a Bachelor of Arts degree in astronomy from Amherst College in 1966, a master's degree in material science from Rice University in 1988, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Astrophysics from Harvard University in 1971. We also have with us this evening Valerie Neal, PhD, who has been a space history curator at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum since 1989 and is the current chair of the Space History Department. Her research, exhibition, and collection responsibilities focus on human spaceflight in the Space Shuttle era and beyond. She's the author of numerous books on spaceflight and science and has curated 3 major exhibitions on space exploration and 8 Smithsonian Channel documentaries. Before joining the Smithsonian, Neal spent a decade in Huntsville, Alabama, writing for NASA. She also participated in underwater astronaut crew training activities and worked in mission support on 4 shuttle missions. She's taught at University of Minnesota, University of Alabama and Huntsville, Vanderbilt University, and Georgetown University. Please join me in welcoming Drs. Neal and Hoffman. Thank you.
So I shall start and be brief because the real star of the show tonight is Dr. Hoffman. I have 2 confessions to make to you to start things. One is that I am not Jewish and I have not been to space, regrettably. However, my bona fides are that I was born in Leo Levi Hospital in Hot Springs, Arkansas, because my mother's physician was Dr. Rosenzweig. And I have visited Israel. So those are my 2 little bits. When I was approached about doing this talk, I hesitated just a bit because I thought I don't know enough about Jews in space, but I couldn't resist the challenge to learn more about the subject. So this has ended up being a really very stimulating exercise for me to prepare for tonight and also to see the exhibition here. And I do recommend that you spend some time with it this evening if you haven't already. As far as I know, the astronaut application form does not have a checkbox that asks for your religion. And the astronaut bios, the official biographies that are online, don't indicate anything about the astronaut's religion. Sometimes you can kind of tease it out based on where they went to school or what organizations they belong to or what awards they received. But as far as I can tell from my experience and the sources I've looked at, religion isn't really a factor in being an astronaut unless you make it one yourself, but it's not one of the qualifications or restrictions or selection criteria that NASA uses. So doing what every good researcher does these days, I started with Wikipedia. And I just Googled Jewish astronauts. And because I had gone through the roster of astronauts and I made some guesses about who might have been Jewish. I only knew for sure that Judy Resnick was. So I made some guesses and then I compared with this list in Wikipedia. And I am assuming that it's fairly accurate, but it may not be wholly accurate. But at least according to that search, there have been 14 Jewish astronauts in space, one of whom actually was a cosmonaut. In fact, the first one was a Soviet cosmonaut, and he first flew in 1965 and then flew again in 1969. And there's one mysterious line in that very brief entry in Wikipedia that said, his mother's Jewish background hindered his selection for space missions. And I thought, now that's kind of intriguing. So I asked my colleague at the museum, who's a specialist in the Soviet space program, what did that really mean? And she gave me a very brief discourse on anti-Semitism in Russia from the time of the Tsars on, and about some relaxation after the revolution, but lingering traditions that might well have caused this as cosmonaut to have been overlooked to be a first. He had a kind of checkered career in the Soviet program because he was bumped from one mission, his second mission, or his second assignment was canceled, and then he finally did get to fly, but both of his missions had problems that nearly killed him. And his name is Boris Volnyov, and he is depicted here in this exhibition. And so I was delighted to find that my discovery had also been discovered here, that the first Jewish person in space was a Soviet cosmonaut. There was another very prominent Jewish man in Russian space history whose name was Boris Chertok, and he rose to a level of great preeminence within the secretive Soviet space program as a rocket engineer who was instrumental really in the design and fabrication of all of the early Soviet rockets and spacecraft. He was, in fact, the deputy to the chief designer, who was never named in public until he died, and that was Sergei Korolev. And Sergei Korolev was kind of a counterpart to our Wernher von Braun in terms of being at the apex of the rocket development. Well, Korolev died suddenly, and Chertok was his deputy, and he was not selected to take over the chief designer position. And he wrote himself that I was not the right ethnicity. He said, if I had, in my biography, if I had been able to say I was Ukrainian or Siberian or anything else, I might have been selected. So that got me thinking then about our astronauts of the 1960s and 70s. The mere fact that Jeff Hoffman, who flew first in 1985, is the first American male Jew to fly in space, and that Judith Resnick, who first flew in 1984, was the first female Jew to fly in space, got me to thinking, out of all those test pilots and combat pilots who were reviewed, and some of whom were selected to be astronauts in the 1960s, were there no qualified pilots, test pilots, combat pilots who were Jewish? Out of the scientific astronauts that were selected in the late 1960s for the Skylab mission and for possibly going to the moon, were there no qualified Jewish scientists and engineers ready to be selected into our astronaut corps? And I've read both books about selecting the astronauts, and I don't recall any mention of religion in those books as a selection criterion at that time. So now I'm on a mission to investigate this further and find out what really was going on in our own space program in the 1960s, and why did it take until the 1980s before Jewish Americans flew in space. If you know why, I would love to talk to you afterward. But I have to confess to being really very innocent and surprised in this matter. Now, the Space Shuttle, which first began flying in 1981, significantly broadened the pool of candidates to become astronauts, because the Space Shuttle could accommodate crews of 7, and only 2 pilots were needed. So that made room for 5 other people to fly on any given shuttle mission, up to 5 people. And then that meant that NASA opened the astronaut corps to a group of people they called mission specialists, who were scientists and engineers who would actually do the missions of the Space Shuttle. They would do the experiments that were on board. They would operate the robotic arm to lift satellites out of the payload bay, or pluck the Hubble Space Telescope out of orbit and put it back in the payload bay so it could be serviced. So the Space Shuttle opened up the astronaut corps to people who were not pilots and test pilots, to people who were PhDs. And throughout the period of the Space Shuttle and now the space station, there have always been more scientists and engineers than pilots in the astronaut corps. And Jeff Hoffman, who is our speaker tonight, was in that first class of astronauts selected in 1978, who began flying in the 1980s. That class of 35 people selected from 8,000 applicants included 6 women, 2 African Americans, 1 Asian American, and everybody else. It was the most diverse, in fact, it was the only diverse astronaut class that had ever been selected. And that has carried forward then to this day. And the Space Shuttle made that kind of diversity possible. Now, when we start talking about Jews in space and the theme of this exhibition about religious thinking and religious faith and its role in space experience, space flight, the philosophy and practice of the space disciplines, we should remember that people who have gone to space generally have admitted to having some kind of spiritual awareness or even a spiritual experience during their space flight. They are struck by the wonder and beauty of the earth as seen from space, the vastness of the heavens, the clarity of the heavens as seen from above Earth's atmosphere. And many of them leave their space flight with a strong sense of the Creator. They don't necessarily couch it in religious terms, but they do admit to having a spiritual experience. But there have been several instances where astronauts have actually performed a religious ritual during their space flight. And perhaps the most memorable is Apollo 8, Do you all remember the Christmas Eve broadcast with the 3 astronauts reading the first verses of Genesis, and how powerful that was on humanity's first mission out, away from our world toward another world in the solar system? This December will be the 50th anniversary of that remarkable mission. On Apollo 11, Buzz Aldrin, who was a practicing Episcopalian, took a tiny wafer and a tiny bit of grape juice with him and had communion on the moon. Privately, it wasn't announced, but that was meaningful for him to do. And in Apollo 15, in 1971, James Irwin had an epiphany. I think one could only call it that, where he actually felt the presence of God in a way that changed his life forever. And thereafter, after he left NASA, he became a witness to the presence of God in our lives and in our universe. I don't know about many shuttle astronauts who have, or who may have done rituals that are that specific or had experiences that are that specific. I do know that there have been some Muslims who have gone into space and who have managed to keep up with their prayers and their other practices while they were in space. And for certain astronauts, I think their faith is an integral, essential part of their being, and they take it with them wherever they go. And our speaker tonight is one of those astronauts, and he has fascinating stories to tell about his space flights, the 5 of them, and about how he, as a Jewish man, brought his faith with him. So let's welcome Jeff Hoffman now, Dr. Jeff Hoffman, to the podium.
Well, thank you, Valerie, and good evening to everybody. So, what's a nice Jewish boy doing in a place like this after being born in Brooklyn? Of course, I'm old enough that as a young boy, I didn't have live astronaut models to dream about. So my heroes, whoa, what's going on here? Wait a minute. You all remember. And actually in the exhibit, they point out the fact that there have been a fair number of Jewish science fiction writers, Isaac Asimov, Hugo Gernsback, and so on. And anyway, when the first real astronauts were selected, they were all military test pilots, and that was not a profession that I aspired to. So although I was always fascinated by the space program, and my dad used to take me to the Hayden Planetarium all the time, I became fascinated by space in general. And in fact, I became an astronomer. I got my PhD in astrophysics at Harvard. And I was interested in the kind of astronomy that you could only do from space. X-rays, gamma rays have a lot of interesting information for astronomers, but they don't penetrate the atmosphere, luckily for us. So you have to go up in, well, I first started with sounding rockets. You can see up there, that's me with my expedition hat on. Little did I know that someday I'd be riding on a rocket, but this was over out in Australia. I did a postdoc in England where I met my wife, and then we came back to Boston. I was working at MIT, and at this point I had graduated to much larger devices, satellites, which we put in space with big rockets. Now we're into the mid to late 70s, and that's when NASA was getting ready to develop the brand new Space Shuttle. And as you heard from Valerie, this really changed the composition of the astronaut corps. And I realized when NASA said, they put out the call for astronaut applications back in '77, we're not looking just for pilots. We want scientists, engineers, medical doctors. And I thought, well, maybe I'll try. And, my wife was, she's a librarian, and I thought, I better have a serious discussion because this is a life-changing, that's, by the way, that was an earlier version of me, in case you're wondering. And she thought it was just a joke, luckily, so we never had to have that conversation. And I always remember, I put in my application, I think in the fall, or no, maybe in the spring of '77. Anyway, we were sitting, she's a librarian, she reads a lot of books, and all of a sudden, she just burst out laughing. I said, what's so funny? She said, you've got to come look at this. Well, it was a book called Growing Up Rich. It was a book by Anne Bernice about Jewish life in New York City. And the paragraph went something like this. There are so many Jews living in New York City that it is impossible to generalize about them. There are Jewish taxi drivers, there are Jewish policemen, there are Jewish politicians. Trying to generalize about Jews in New York City would be like trying to generalize about Japanese in Tokyo or Germans in Berlin. About the only safe generalization that you can make about Jews in New York City is that no New York Jew ever has been or ever will be an astronaut. So after I was selected, and that's, you can see me there, I did write to the author, and she congratulated me and said, well, I guess if I ever bring out a second edition, I'm going to have to change the book. So anyway, training to be an astronaut, these were things that growing up as a young boy and becoming a scientist, I mean, I never figured I was going to be flying in supersonic jets, and it was a total change in life, as well as moving to Houston, as you can imagine. So there's a few real exciting steps in the career of an astronaut. Of course, the first is when you get the call from Houston and they ask you, do you still want to be an astronaut? Well, yes, sir. And, well, we would like to offer you the job. And the second is when you are given your first flight assignment, which I got actually back in 1984, but back in the day, shuttle flights were being canceled, crews were being switched around. We trained for 4 different flights before we finally flew in April of 1985. About a week before you fly, you go into medical quarantine. They don't want you to be exposed to common cold germs. It happened to be Passover, so I brought some matzah with me, and they take care of serving us food in quarantine, and the woman who runs the shuttle food service was in there, and I asked, do you think I could take some matzah into space because it is Passover? And she was not familiar with matzah, so she picked up a piece and broke it, and of course, what happens? Crumbs, you all know matzah. So, well, crumbs in space are actually a significant problem when you think about it. They don't fall down to the floor like they do on Earth, where you can just vacuum them up. They float around where you can breathe them in. And she took one look at those crumbs and said, I'm sorry, those matzahs are not space qualified. So, and actually, we don't take regular bread. Here's Marcia Ivins, another Jewish astronaut, showing this is the tortilla is the standard thing that we use because, first of all, it's easy to pack things inside them, and you don't have to, they don't make crumbs. Well, we were members of the local synagogue down in Clear Lake. That's about 30 miles south of Houston, conservative synagogue. Before I went in space, the rabbi asked me, would I be interested in taking any Jewish ceremonial objects with me? And I thought about it. And I said, sure. What did you have in mind? He said, well, I'll put you in touch with some Jewish artists, and you can talk with them. So that became something that I did on actually all of my space flights. Here's a mezuzah, which is actually on display outside. Now, you have to be adaptable when you go into space. You cannot nail the mezuzah to the door, okay? You use your imagination. So, as with everything, spaceflight would be impossible without Velcro. And so you Velcro the mezuzah to the door. Also, there was a Jewish fabric artist who wove the atarot for 2 tallisim, which my sons used for their bar mitzvahs. I have two sons. This is a passage from the book of Job, the voice from the whirlwind, where God says, can you direct the stars of Orion? And my son's name is Oren. I actually wanted to name him Orion, but my wife vetoed that idea. And for about a week, he had no name at all because we couldn't agree. And then my mother came up with the idea, well, instead of Orion, why not call him Oren, which is what his name is. But Orion has sort of stuck with it. So again, this will go on exhibit a little bit later, I think, in the month. That turned out to be a rather unique flight. It was going to be what we would call a kind of a milk run for the shuttle. Back in the early days of the shuttle, particularly before the Challenger disaster, almost all of our flights, we would be taking satellites up into space, release them, and then come back home. Well, that's what we were supposed to do. We had 2 satellites. And the first one went up just fine. The second one did not turn on. There was a problem with the ignition circuit. And so NASA sent me and my partner out to do what was actually the very first unplanned contingency, they call it, spacewalk in NASA's history. Totally by luck. So, you can look on the source of luck in many ways, but it certainly played a big role in my career because 8 years later, when it was time to select the crew for who was going to go up and repair the Hubble Space Telescope, and those of you who are old enough remember what a disaster it was when the Hubble telescope was put in orbit and it couldn't see straight, and NASA was the butt of jokes of late-night comedians, and the Hubble telescope was denounced in the halls of Congress as a techno-turkey, and really the future of NASA's human spaceflight program was riding on the success of this mission. And because it was so critical, they said only astronauts who have previously done spacewalks are eligible to do the spacewalks on Hubble, and I had my union card. And so there I was. It was this is an extraordinary experience, and so both as an astronomer and an astronaut, to have been able to put my own 2 hands on the Hubble telescope in space and actually fix it so that it could bring us these extraordinary views of our universe was just the thrill of a lifetime. Now, it turns out, just like my first flight took place during Pesach, we were up in the Hubble telescope mission in December, which happened to be when Hanukkah was going to occur. I had been in Israel the summer before and had met some Jewish artists in Jerusalem, and they very kindly made for me a silver dreidel and a Hanukkah, again, which are on display, and I hope you'll get a chance to see it afterwards. Now, these are religious symbols, and so I just, after we had finished all the repairs, just privately, I took the dreidel out and I was spinning it, and I wanted to show my crewmates what this was. What I didn't realize was that the TV camera was on and was sending these pictures down to the ground. So I'm going to show you the video that was, these videos were picked up by a Jewish TV station in Los Angeles, and they turned it into a nice professional job. But you'll hear the call coming up from Mission Control, which I was totally not anticipating, but Susan Helms saw what I was doing, and you'll hear her say, "Jeff, I'll bet all of America would like to know what you're doing up there." And I said, "Oh, God," I didn't, but then I said, "All right, they asked." So I went into my spiel about Hanukkah, and let me now, if I can get this to work right, I can actually show it to you, so hang in there.
Mission Specialist Jeff Hoffman, relaxing before the walk out to the Astro van that'll carry them out to the pad.
I feel like a spinning top or a dreidel. The spinning don't stop when you leave the cradle. You just slow down. Round and around this world you go, spinning through the lives of the people you know. We all slow down. How you gonna keep on turning from day to day? How you gonna keep from turning your life away? No days you can borrow, no time you can buy, no trust in tomorrow, it's a lie.
In Denver, Houston, for Jeff, all of America would like to know what you've got and what you're doing with it.
Well, this is the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah, and there's various ways that we celebrate it. And one of the games that we play is a little game with a dreidel, and it's something that you spin, and then you see which side comes up, and according to that, you either win or lose. And I was just trying to see how you might reinterpret the rules for space flight, since there's no up or down. And I guess on the subject, Hanukkah is the festival of lights. It lasts 8 days, and to celebrate it, we light a little menorah, which has 8 candles, and you light one more every day until finally on the 8th day, you have 8 candles. And so I brought a little traveling menorah. Of course, up here in the shuttle, we're not going to actually light the candles, but to help the celebration of the season, I brought it along. It's a little silver traveling menorah. And so with that and the dreidel, I'm all set for my onboard Hanukkah celebration.
So, that was my 4th space flight, and then my 5th space flight was remarkable for several ways. This was STS, that's Space Transportation System, that's what they called the flights, and everyone had a number. But if you Google UFOs on STS-75, you will find out that we have the honor of being the mission which actually photographed UFOs, and of course NASA suppressed it. I can tell you that it was a photographic anomaly. We did not see any flying saucers, no little green men, but it's there on the web, and I just thought it was worth mentioning. But once again, I did take some of the Jewish ceremonial objects, including a menorah. Now, on this flight, we had what we call a 2-shift, 24-hour-a-day operation, which means we had 2 shifts of crews, and one crew would sleep in these sleeping compartments. When everybody sleeps at the same time, we don't use the sleeping compartment. You get in a little sleeping bag, and you can sort of either strap yourself to the wall, or I just like to kind of float freely. But and you had to share the bunks, so it's called hot bunking, because we didn't have there's not a separate bunk for each of the 7 people. So I decided, rather than I would put the little mezuzah in here, in my bunk, on Velcro, and I'd put it in when I was ready to go to sleep, and then in the morning I would remove it because I didn't, want to impose any of my own religious beliefs on anybody else. About the third day of the mission, the crew member who was sharing the bunk, because we had the longest bunk because both of us were tall, I had apparently forgotten to remove it that day. And when he got up from his sleep shift, he floated over to me and he said, "Hey Jeff, that was a pretty nice idea having the mezuzah in our sleep station." And I said, "Scott Horowitz, of course." So yeah, that's Scott there. And Scott, actually, Valerie, you could check that he may have been the first Jewish test pilot astronaut. I'm not. He was certainly the first PhD test pilot, and so everybody called him Doc. So Doc Horowitz. The other thing that I did on that mission, we had since moved to downtown Houston, so we were in a different synagogue, a different rabbi, and for the last 3 flights I had been on, he had been asking me, "Hey, Jeff, I know you've taken dreidels, you've taken tallisim, you've taken Hanukkah. How about taking a Torah into space?" I said, "Rabbi, Torah, it's too big. They allow us to take a certain number of personal objects, which can include religious objects, but they all have to be packed into something about this size." So I said, if you can get a miniature Torah that's actually kosher, that we could read from, that would be fine. And he spent years looking for it. Finally, he located a rabbi here in New York who about 25 years before had purchased a totally legible kosher Torah from a scribe in Jerusalem. And our rabbi asked if he could purchase it and bring it to Houston. And the rabbi in New York said, "No, it's too precious. I mean, I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but it's too special to sell." And my rabbi said, "Well, somebody in my congregation is an astronaut, and he would like to take the Torah into space." And the New York rabbi said, "That's what I've been saving it for." And so it came to Houston, and indeed, it went up into space. And of course, we didn't have a minyan, so you can't say the normal prayers, but everything in space is done with cue cards. And so I made up a special cue card with the help of the rabbi with some special prayers, which we said, and actually performed a little ceremony where I read from the Torah. In fact, and we have a video of this, and I showed it about a year ago to a rabbinical college up in Boston, and some people there said, this has to be made. We need to show this to other people because of its significance. And so there's actually now a project going on to make a real professional movie about the Space Torah. If you're interested in finding out about it, Google Space Torah project, and there's a little couple of minute introduction to the project. The person who filmed it was my good friend Claude Nicollier, a Swiss astronaut who is not Jewish, but he was very good. He filmed the whole ceremony, and when it was over, he said, "Jeff, I have no idea what you were doing, but it certainly looked impressive." So that was the Torah in space. It's now, and I, of course, it really belonged to our congregation, who still has it in Houston. After we came back, our rabbi had the idea of let's invite the rabbi from New York to come down to Houston and thank him for this. And then he suggested, we're going to do a ceremony. You know, there's all the mitzvot that you can do, and one of the mitzvot is to write a Torah, which very few people can do. But as in many things in Judaism, there's ways around it. So if you can repair a Torah, you get credit for it. You get credit for the mitzvah. And so what he did, we all lined up in the congregation, and the rabbi, he took a little razor, and he would scrape a tiny bit of a letter, and then he would hand us the little brush with the special ink, and we would just fill in that little nick that he took off. So all of us, everybody in the congregation had a chance to perform the mitzvah of writing a Torah. Then I left NASA. I went off to be NASA's representative in France for a few years, and then came back where I'm now at MIT. And a couple of years ago, in 2013, it was the 20th anniversary of the Space Torah, and the congregation in Houston invited me to come down for a celebration, and I was absolutely delighted that this little Space Torah, it's not being treated as a museum piece. They use it. The kids love it because everybody now can be Hagba and Galila, you know. You don't have to lug a big Torah around. And the kids love to read from it for their bar and bat mitzvahs. So, and what was really nice, in celebration of the 20th anniversary, one of the congregants had made, instead of the normal Torah decorations for the top, they replaced them with two little silver shuttles. So it's down there, and as I say, it's still in use, and it's a Torah is a living document. And one of the go on the website and find out more about the Space Torah, because what we're hoping is that we'll be able to make it into a video and share the experience with many people. So I want to finish a little bit, because we want to leave some time for questions, but to talk a little bit about the spiritual nature of going into space, because this is a special audience and people often ask. Now, I've done a lot of mountaineering in my life, and there's many people have written about spiritual aspects of being in the mountains, and I find many similarities between the experiences that I've had in mountaineering and in space. You have to take a certain risk and work to get up to the high regions, but once you're up there, you're separated from the rest of humanity. You are looking at the world from a very different perspective. Somehow your mind feels a certain clarity. Your vision is longer. And of course, space is higher than the highest mountain. And those senses are magnified. The perspective is so different. Take a look at this picture. Look at the sun. You've never seen the sun like this, and I'm not talking about the rays coming out of it. Those are artifacts of the camera lens. I don't know if anybody has figured out yet what's so strange about this, but you go out on a nice day and you look up in the sky, and what do you see? You see the sun in the blue sky. You've never seen the sun in a black sky. We see the stars in a black sky because they don't have enough light to scatter off the atmosphere, which is what makes the sky blue, of course. But from space, of course, you're above the atmosphere, and you see the sun in its true nature as a star. Of course, it's close to us, so it's bigger and brighter than any of the other stars, but just one example of the difference in how the world looks. But even more than how the world looks is how the world and how your own body feels. Weightlessness, we talk about it, but language is based on shared experience, and here's some, language fails us. We try to take pictures to convey the magic. It's almost miraculous. one of my crewmates was an amateur juggler, and he used to say that since time immemorial, the dream of jugglers was to make it appear as though the balls are suspended in midair. Well, it's not a dream. In space, you can do it. And, my magic carpet this is not photoshopped. It's the real thing. So, we're kind of on the verge of a revolution in space flight. You've all heard about SpaceX and the Falcon rockets, which are bringing down the cost of space flight, and Richard Branson and Virgin Galactic, who's going to offer suborbital space flight, and Jeff Bezos with the Blue Origin. I'm up to now, about 560 human beings have been in orbit around the Earth. I'm hoping that 10 to 20 years from now, 10 or 100 times that number, because the experience is profound. It's life-changing, and looking at the world from a different perspective really changes people's feelings about the world. Particularly, you sense, I was out in a spacesuit, holding my hand in front of my face, realizing there's a vacuum between my face and my hand. You appreciate the hostility of most of the universe to life. And then you look down at our beautiful planet and you understand how almost miraculous it is that life can exist on Earth. If you haven't been watching the new National Geographic series, One Strange Rock, which I'm in, I recommend it to you because it's about our planet Earth, one strange rock, how it was formed, how the Earth protects us from the nasty stuff that the sun throws at us, how life evolved on the Earth, how life is able to survive. And I think many astronauts come back with much more of an ecological sensitivity, even if they didn't have that when they went up. If you haven't seen the exhibit that is on display outside, I highly recommend that you look through it, and you'll see some of the artifacts that I took with me. What I'd like to do now is, to the extent that I can do it with images, to share with you a little bit of the almost spiritual experience that you get floating around the Earth and looking down on it. What I'm going to show you are images taken by astronauts on the International Space Station. I took a lot of images of the Earth, but their cameras are so much better now that I like to show what they did. So just sit back for a bit and imagine that you're floating weightless, looking out the window, and I don't know if we can turn the lights down, but that'll be nice. Now you're moving much slower for real. This is time-lapse photography. Volcanoes looked at from the top. You see the oceans, the deserts. This is the cupola on the space station where a lot of these pictures were taken from. And the Earth at night is almost magical. It's surrounded by a halo, a glowing layer of gases about 60 miles up. You can see the lights of civilization all the way out to the horizon. And the aurora, sometimes you fly right through it. You You all recognize this, I hope. And there we are. Seeing lightning storms from above is the most incredible light show that I've ever seen. There's Denmark, southern Sweden, the Baltic Sea, the Nile Delta, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Ireland, Great Britain. There's Paris coming up. Going down the west coast of South America. And again, lightning storms out over the Pacific. Space sunrise. The whole universe. I never get tired of looking at that. It brings back the experience. And astronauts never get tired of looking out the window. People would often ask me, what did I do in my spare time? Did I bring books to read or movies to watch? And actually, when they're up in 6 months in the space station, yeah, they do sometimes look at movies or read books. But by and large, the favorite recreational activity is just looking out the window. So this is my farewell slide. I hope that I've given you not just a sense of the trajectory of my own career and how a nice Jewish boy got involved in going to a place like this, but also on a much deeper human level, some of the, and I have to say, NASA does not send us up into space so that we can have these existential experiences, right? They send us up to do useful work, and I can vouch that I have done lots of useful work up in space, but it is, on a personal level, a life-changing experience. Not just the view, but as I say, the experience of the change in the human body and the freedom of being weightless that makes you aware that there are so many varieties of human experiences that we're probably not even aware of yet. I mean, until the dawn of the space age, people didn't know that it was possible not to weigh anything, and the incredible things that does for your body. What else are we going to discover as human beings leave the Earth and go to places that we've never been before and try to learn to survive in environments that we've never done? And I'll just share with you the one thing that I'm doing, which hopefully will help make that possible. Alas, I'm never going to get to Mars myself, but I'm one of the principal investigators on an experiment that will be going to Mars on the next big rover in 2020. And for the first time, we're starting to think about, what do we really have to do to make it possible for humans to live on the surface of another planetary body for a long time? And one of the things you need to learn to do, just like all explorers, you need to learn to live off the land. You can't keep bringing everything that you need. The logistics would just be too difficult. So our experiment for the very first time is going to produce oxygen on the surface of Mars And we're going to do it using local Mars resources. We'll take the carbon dioxide out of the Mars atmosphere and split out the oxygen atoms. So in a couple of years, when you hear about the next big rover going to Mars and you hear about producing oxygen on the surface of Mars, you'll know you heard it first here. We call the experiment MOXIE, actually. Some of you may recognize the name as an old soft drink, but it stands for the Mars Oxygen ISRU experiment. So, as I say, that's looking ahead to the future of humanity off the surface of planet Earth. And, you know, who knows what the future is going to bring. It's going to be, I hope, very exciting. I've certainly been very fortunate to have been able to play, granted a small part, but a very exciting one for me personally. And you probably noticed that I enjoy talking about it. I never get tired because the more I talk about space, it sort of brings back the experience. And I mean, I wish I could go and have that experience again. Don't tell my wife, please. But that probably isn't going to happen. So the best I can do is to show the pictures and try to share the experiences with wonderful audiences like you. So thank you very much.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Before we go to audience Q&A, Jeff and I are going to talk about just a couple of things for a few minutes. And I have two questions in mind that I would like to toss to you for some reaction, and maybe a third if we have time. But be thinking of what you might want to ask him yourself while he's here on the stage or immediately after in the little reception. And the first one I'd like to ask you is, you and Judy Resnick were both in that first class of astronauts selected for the Space Shuttle in 1978. And did you kind of recognize each other as fellow Jewish astronauts? Did you think about it consciously when you were both named to flights that you were going to be the first? And then as other astronauts joined the Corps, did the Jewish astronauts kind of recognize each other and share a special bond or socialize a little bit together or compare notes on what it meant to be Jewish and going to space?
Well, I hope you won't be disappointed if the answer is basically no. You know, religion was a very personal thing. I mean, Judy and I, obviously, we knew each other was Jewish, and I would wish her a happy Hanukkah, and likewise, and that was about the extent of it, really. We knew, you know, more people obviously went to church than to synagogue, but, you know, that was a personal thing, and in the office, we talked space stuff, not religion. So yeah, it's a very personal thing. Some people were more religious than others, and that was their personal decisions.
Actually, I'm not disappointed that you said that at all. I
have to tell the truth.
I'm actually a little bit relieved because, as I said at the start of the talk, I had never really thought about who was Jewish, who was Christian, who was Catholic, who was Protestant. You know, because that just isn't part of the job description, you might say. And I tended to know about the astronauts in terms of you're an astronomer, somebody else is an MD, somebody else is a crystal specialist, somebody else is a veterinarian. And so in that professional environment, that's sort of where people's identity rests in their academic specialty.
There was one interesting thing, though. As I mentioned, back in the early days, flights kept getting canceled. We kept getting reassigned to new flights. In late 1980, or sort of the middle of 1985, NASA had a policy in order to encourage countries and companies to launch their satellites on the shuttle rather than on other vehicles like the European Ariane rocket. the deal was if you launch a satellite on the shuttle, then you can fly somebody from your country or your company as a payload specialist, meaning not a trained astronaut, but essentially a passenger. The government of Saudi Arabia had a satellite that they signed up to launch on the shuttle, and Sultan, a Saudi Arabian prince, flew with that. And it looked for a time when one of our many flights got canceled that we were going to be assigned to take that satellite into space. And I commented to my commander, what are the Saudis going to say when they find out that a Jew is going to launch their satellite? And he said, I never thought of that. I better go talk to headquarters. And as it turned out, we didn't get assigned to that flight, so it never came up.
Interesting. You mentioned that you and Scott Horowitz flew together and almost didn't realize that you were both Jews on the same mission. Well, we knew we were.
It just hadn't occurred to me at the time, anyway.
Well, and the press didn't make anything of that, as I recall.
I knew he was because we had to. His brother is actually extremely Orthodox, and we had to do a little bit of searching for kosher restaurants in Cocoa Beach.
Ah.
There is one.
Oh, there is. That's good to know. The press did make a big deal, though, when 2 African Americans were on the same mission, or when 2 women were on the same mission.
We had one flight with 3 women, actually.
Or exactly, one mission with 3 women.
Big lines in the bathroom.
Of course.
I'm not sure I'm supposed to say that anymore, but that was a standard joke at the time.
I realized, though, that there was a mission before the one you and Doc Horowitz were on that had two Jewish mission specialists. I think they were both mission specialists. Dave Wolf and Martin Fettman were on STS-58, and I don't think that made the press either. So, okay, thank you for sharing that. You have satisfied my curiosity now about that. You weren't a little club within the astronaut corps. You all were just fully integrated in and kept your faith practices as you wished. Another question I have for you, since you're an astronomer and an astronomer in the space age, is how has our view of the cosmos changed since you went through your undergraduate and graduate work? The missions that you've flown, the telescopes that we've put into space. Do we have a different sense of the cosmos now, and does that have a bearing on our faith, or may that have a bearing on our faith, or has it affected you and your faith in any way?
Well, it sure has changed, and Hubble telescope has played a big role in that, actually rewriting astronomy books over and over. But when you think back to the history of humanity's view of the cosmos, I mean, we started out believing that we were the center of the universe and that everything revolved around the Earth. I mean, that was the Ptolemaic theory of the universe. And then along came Copernicus and the Copernican revolution, and all of a sudden the Earth was no longer the center of the solar system. The sun was. But the sun was the center of the universe. Right. So, we're pretty egotistical in that sense. And then along comes modern astronomy, and they realize that we live in a galaxy and that our sun, in fact, is not in the center of the galaxy. We're way out in the hinterlands, about 3/4 of the way out to the edge of the galaxy. And then, when you look out, there's these things called nebula, cloudy objects, and some of them turn out to be rather close. They're in our own galaxy. But it was Edwin Hubble, after whom the Hubble telescope was named, who realized he developed a method of determining how far away stars were, and if he could see those certain types of stars in these fuzzy objects, he could measure the distance to those objects, and some of those fuzzy objects were much, much farther away. And he came to realize that they were not part of our galaxy. He called them island universes. We now call them other galaxies. And he was able to measure both the distance to those galaxies, and he could also mention the speed with which they were moving towards us or away from us. And what he found was that the by and large, most galaxies are moving away from us, and the farther away they are, the faster they're moving. And what that suggested was, and this was the origin of the concept of the Big Bang, which hopefully you've all heard of, that at least the universe as we know it started as a very compact blob and just blew up, and it's still expanding. And the story goes on. People thought that our galaxy was the center of the universe because all the galaxies seemed to be moving away from us. But it turns out that it doesn't matter where you are, anywhere in the universe, it will look like all the galaxies are moving away from you. So once again, humans we keep getting displaced from being the center of things. And it gets worse because the one thing that we absolutely knew was that everything in the universe has gravity, and this gravity obviously is slowing down the expansion of the universe. But we couldn't really measure the rate at which this expansion was slowing down unless you can measure galaxies that are really far away, which the Hubble telescope is able to do. And so that was one of the prime observing tasks in the early days after we fixed Hubble. There were two independent teams whose job it was to make a lot of these measurements and determine the rate at which the expansion of the universe was slowing down. And they didn't publish for a long time, and nobody knew why. And then the reason was because what they found, and they finally compared their results, and what they had both found is that the expansion of the universe is not slowing down, it's accelerating. Totally unimagined by anybody. And in order to, well, I don't even want to say explain it, but they said, well, some force has to be driving this acceleration. We'll call it dark energy. You may have heard of dark energy. And it's nice to give it a name because it makes it sound like you know what you're talking about. But in fact, we don't have a clue. But what has happened is, and by the way, astronomers have also known in studying the dynamics of galaxies that there's about 5 times as much matter in galaxies as we can actually see as stars. This is the so-called dark matter. We've known about that for about 50 years, although Hubble has allowed us to measure it more precisely. But we've also now been able to measure what fraction of the universe is made of dark matter, what fraction is made of dark energy, and what fraction is the normal matter, that we're all made of. Well, it turns out dark energy is almost 3/4 of the universe. We don't have a clue what it is. Dark matter, almost another quarter of the universe. We know where it is. It surrounds galaxies, but we don't know what it is. What we do know, and when I tell this to my students, I sort of apologize. I'm very sorry, but everything that you've learned about physics, chemistry, biology really only applies to 4% of the universe. And so when you talk about the position of humans being pushed further and further away from the center of the universe, now even the stuff that we're made of is just a tiny little fraction of what's in the universe. Now, that's what makes science exciting. Every time you solve a problem, 2 new questions come up. But this has profoundly changed our concept of our position in the universe. What you make of it from a spiritual and religious point of view, people can have different opinions of it, but it's just been a profound transformation over the last 100 years.
And we have the new James Webb telescope coming up in a couple of years, which is going to push those boundaries even farther and open up yet more questions. So it's like the more refined our observing techniques are, the less we know. The more we learn, but the less we know with certainty.
Well, that's what happens every time if all you can see is with your naked eye everything going around the Earth, then the geocentric view of the universe makes perfect sense. It's not until you make more and more accurate observations that the Ptolemaic theory broke down and the Copernican theory of the Earth going around the sun became a much simpler way of explaining what we could observe. And again, until we could make these precise observations with the Hubble telescope, we could not measure that the expansion of the universe was accelerating. So yeah, when Webb comes along, who knows what new discoveries we'll make and what new questions will open up. But as I say, that's what keeps science exciting.
Exactly. And for those of you in the audience who are young, you've got your work cut out for you if you want to make real contributions to knowledge. Okay, I have one more question before we go to the audience, and Eddie is going to manage that. And that is, we didn't mention Ilan Ramon in our earlier remarks, and Ilan Ramon is the other Jewish astronaut who was not a U.S. astronaut. And he was a hero in Israel already as a fighter pilot, very effective in the Israeli Air Force. And through an agreement with NASA, Israel was able to fly their first astronaut on the Space Shuttle. And the terrible misfortune of that was that after a hugely successful 14-day mission on Columbia in 2003, the mission ended in tragedy when Columbia disintegrated over Texas during its return home. But Ilan Ramon had been a very key figure in that mission and on the crew, and in the eyes of Jewish people around the world, I think, because he saw his role being in space to really represent Jewish people worldwide and to represent Israel. And he also took some Judaica with him.
Including
and are you
the Torah.
aware of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, would you talk a little bit about that? And there's going to be a program here in a couple of weeks that I encourage all of you to return for because it will focus specifically on Ilan Ramon.
Well, I knew Ilan. I had actually left the astronaut corps to go over to my job in Europe. But I would come back to Houston a couple of times every year, and I made it my business to look up Ilan because he was a Jewish astronaut from Israel, and he had known of me because I had been in Israel several times, and there were articles about, because I was a Jewish astronaut in Israeli magazines. So we got to know each other rather well. Also his wife, who is a remarkable, very, very strong woman, the tragedies that she's had to live through is. But one I think extraordinary thing about Ilan, we've had many international astronauts who have come to fly as what we used to call them payload specialists. It meant they were not professional astronauts. They would come and fly for just one mission and then go back to whatever they were doing before. And by and large, the crew that they were flying with, of course, they'd get to know, but the rest of the astronaut office really, you didn't pay that much attention. You didn't really get to know these people. They weren't around that long. Ilan, because his flight was delayed and delayed and delayed, spent a couple of years in the astronaut office, and I think partly because his reputation as a heroic pilot in the Israeli Air Force, a lot of the professional astronaut pilots, they wanted to talk with him. I mean, I remember one time, this was previous, I was giving a tour to a colonel who was a pilot in the Israeli Air Force, and we were walking through the halls, passing John Young, who was the head of the astronaut office. And I mean, John was the astronaut's astronaut, a great pilot, Navy pilot, test pilot, 2 flights on Gemini, 2 flights to the moon, walked on the moon, he commanded the first shuttle flight. I mean, there wasn't anything you could teach him about flying airplanes or flying spacecraft. But when I introduced him, normally you meet a visitor in the hall and John will just say, hello, and then be on his way. And I said, this is a colonel from the Israeli Air Force. And he stopped and he said, how do you guys get those F-16s to do all those things that we can't do with them? I mean, they really respected him, and I think Ilan benefited from that same sort of respect. He was very popular in the astronaut office. What a tragedy.
And I know that he took at least one mezuzah and possibly more than one on his mission, because we have a duplicate of it in the collection at the Air and Space Museum that Israel presented to the Smithsonian. And he had taken a very special Torah with him. Do you know that story?
Well, it was from the survival, but why
Yes.
don't you tell
No,
because
go
you'll get
ahead.
you'll get the details better than I.
Well, the details will come in the program later this month, but he took with him a Torah that had been given to him by a survivor of the Holocaust who had been in Bergen-Belsen. And after the tragedy, there was this massive search across Texas and Louisiana to try to collect every bit of debris from the shuttle so they could reconstruct what may have happened, and also so they could return personal matters to the families of those 7 astronauts who died. And that Torah has not yet been found.
but they did find his notebook.
That's
which,
it,
which was
and that's
pretty
the
amazing.
miracle.
Yeah.
Talk about that then.
Well, the thing is that if a rock falls from space, it falls fast through the atmosphere and it burns up, unless it's big enough, and then it, of course, hits the ground. But if you take a piece of paper, it has so much friction and not very much weight, and it actually comes down very slowly, and it will survive re-entry. So a great many objects actually survived even after the Columbia broke up. And it was just extraordinary. They found Ilan's personal notebook where he had taken all the notes about his impressions during the flight, and that was given to his wife.
And in my view, that's a miracle that offsets the loss of the Torah. But I also have faith that that Torah may be found someday, assuming it was in some kind of protective cover. As you know,
hard to say because the Torah is more dense, and so it may have burned up.
we'll never know. We may never know. Okay.
Please join me in thanking Drs. Neal and Hoffman for this really enlightening program. And as they both mentioned, the film about Ilan Ramon and the Torah that he brought into space will be shown here on June 21st at 6:30 p.m. Please join us for that, and it will also be followed by discussion with the director, Dan Cohen. Now we're able to take a few questions, and let's keep this as questions and not comments, maybe. But here we go. There's one person right here.
I just wanted to add to that mystery from Dr. Neal, and I did have one quick question for Dr. Hoffman. Regarding the Jews having a long delay in going into space, the very, very famous space travel television series Star Trek, the three of the main characters, the Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, and then the navigator, Mr. Chekhov, were portrayed by Jewish actors. However, none of the characters they portrayed were supposed to be Jewish. So that sort of adds a little to that.
I'm not sure if they have Jews on Vulcan.
I don't know. They do have
You if you look at our exhibit, you can see some information about that.
Long and prosper. Okay, my quick question for Dr. Hoffman, because I know there are many people waiting. Okay. After the last of the rockets or the journeys to the moon, there was a tapering off of our space program, as I understand it. There was a little revival going on with all the Mars probes, the Vikings and then the probes. But it seems to me that the economy is the biggest enemy of space travel and exploration, because people want to spend the money here on this planet and they don't want to send as many things into space. What would you, in your opinion, advise to get our nation and other nations revved up again to go back into space?
Actually, we're living in exciting times now because where the government has, NASA's budget has been pretty constant for the last 15, 20 years. But what has really changed is the American capitalism seems maybe will make the biggest revolutionary change. I mean, we have right now 4 different privately designed and built human space capsules are being readied for launch. We have SpaceX, Blue Origin, Boeing, Sierra Nevada. Privately developed rockets, which tremendous innovation. I mean, the idea of being able to reuse the rocket to land the parts of the rocket. So the idea is that if we can make space travel more affordable and hopefully safer, it will give more people the opportunity to go in space. We haven't yet seen the real start of space tourism, but it's on the horizon. I don't know how it's all going to play out. Invite me back in 5 years and I'll talk about it. But that I think is very hopeful, and we're all waiting for Richard Branson to start his flights and SpaceX to get there and Blue Origin. So we'll see.
And in the meantime, I think we're in a golden age of planetary
the science programs are very exciting.
And astronomical investigation. But we have rovers and cruisers deployed all over the solar system right now, and sending back wondrous images and information about the planets and their moons.
Next, this woman right here.
Hello, I bring regards from my dad, David Gursky. And my question to you is, how did your Jewish astrophysicist colleagues react to being a Jew in space, and also in the programs you were working with at MIT?
Well, it was not, I'd say the initial reaction of my astrophysical colleagues at MIT when I got selected to be an astronaut was, "You're too smart to do that, you're wasting your brain." I had made the decision a long time ago if I got selected. I mean, I enjoyed the scientific research that I was doing, but I always wanted to go in space, and NASA was actually going to give me a chance to do it. No way was I going to turn it down. And in the end, I suspect that by helping to fix the Hubble Space Telescope, I probably made, I mean, I don't know what I would have discovered had I continued to be a research astronomer, but I probably made more of a contribution to astronomy by fixing the Hubble telescope than I ever would have done in person. So I have no regrets.
Let's give someone up there a chance. This guy right here.
Hi, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned the thing about the UFOs, and I've seen that tape, and it's all very fuzzy. But I just really want you to expand a little bit. Like, what did you see, and what did you think it was?
Well, when I have to now give a little bit of an explanation. We don't actually have the picture. You probably, when I showed it, there was that big fuzzy disk with a black hole in the middle. What we were doing on that mission was to deploy what we called the tethered satellite, and this was a very unique engineering experiment where we launched a satellite from the shuttle, but it stayed attached to the shuttle by a 20-kilometer long tether, a thin wire, and electricity would go up and down because the wire was an electrical conductor, and it was moving through the Earth's magnetic field at 5 miles a second, generated a big voltage, if you remember your high school physics, about 4,000 volts. And unfortunately, there was a little bit of a failure of the insulation, and so there was a short circuit, there was a spark, it melted the tether, and when the satellite was about 20 kilometers away and we had all this length of tether, the tether broke. And because it melted from the spark, there were all sorts of little blobs of plastic that were floating around, and they were so close to the camera that they were out of focus. They looked like big discs. And you could see them as they would move in front of the tether. But the problem was that given the TV cameras that we had at the time, the tether had completely saturated the camera, and so when these big out-of-focus circular blobs moved very close to the camera, and the tether was pretty far away at that point, it looked like they were actually going behind the tether. And so if you do the mathematics, that meant that those little circular blobs must have been, 50 yards in diameter, and so what else could they have been but UFOs? And NASA was once again suppressing all this information. It was just out-of-focus sparks from the tether, but you can still find it on YouTube, as you said. So no, I don't believe that we ever have seen little green men from the space shuttle. I mean, we were always on the lookout, just in case. It would have been a great discovery, but no.
Let's man in the green.
When you were fixing Hubble, in the process of fixing it, what were the one or two really most difficult things about it? And while you were working on it, did you say, God help me at any time?
Hubble was very complex. It was a absolutely critical mission. We certainly expected that some things would go wrong. The very first day, the first job that we had was to replace the gyroscopes, which had found there were many things wrong with Hubble besides just the optics. And we had practiced this and developed some new techniques, and it went perfectly, the very first thing we did. And so my colleague, Story Musgrave, went off to do another job, and all I had to do was close the doors to the telescope, which we had done, dozens of times underwater. And I closed the first latch, and then there's latches up at the top and the bottom, wouldn't close. I did not say, God help me. I don't want to tell you what I was actually saying. It's not in the... but, this was the very first job on the first day of what was such a critical mission, and if we couldn't get these doors closed, we lose the telescope. I'll cut the long story short. It took two of us, and we had to figure out a new way to use a special kind of a tool. It was one of these ratchet devices, and we were going to wrap it around two little handholds. And the engineers on the ground, I think, couldn't quite get what we were going to try to do. And this was a device that could exert up to 2,000 pounds of force. And I think that they thought that we were going to wrap it around the entire telescope and then crank it. And they had this vision of Hubble collapsing like an aluminum beer can. So they didn't want us to do it. And we said, well, we have to do it. That's the only way we're going to get the door closed. And we had been out 8 hours at that point, and my battery was starting to get low. And finally, the flight director, Milt Heflin, and this is the flight director is ultimately the boss during a mission. And I remember when he called up, he said, all right, we're running out of time. On the ground, we obviously don't have as good a situational awareness as the astronauts. They're not going to hurt Hubble. We just better let them get on with it. And so we did, and we fixed it. But that was certainly the most what we call white knuckle moments.
Just go right here.
There's some questions at the back too.
Yeah.
How do you play a board game in space?
Well, if you want to play checkers or chess, you better have magnetic pieces, because if you don't, here's a checker piece, you try to put it down on a black square, it's just going to float up, and you'll never be able to have a checker game. So you need to use, and that's true about so many things, that the world is different when gravity doesn't pull you to the ground. So yeah, board games, you'd have to use magnetism, or maybe Velcro. Velcro would work too.
Can we go to the back? There are a few people back there. And also, we'll also have time afterwards at the reception to meet and greet our speakers if you have any questions that we don't have time for here, and we really only have time for one or two more. So you could see them out there.
From everything we've learned over the last couple of decades, the hardest part of finally exploring and pioneering on Mars is the gravity that you mentioned. And I was curious, from your own personal experience of weightlessness for some period of time, it's pretty large. Do you have any insights into how we're going to solve that last problem of getting to and being on Mars?
Well, when you're up for 2 weeks in space on the Space Shuttle, you don't have to worry too much about being weightless. And in fact, they always, astronauts like to exercise, and so they always had a treadmill on the shuttle. And on my first flight, some of the other crew, they were running on the treadmill, and so I figured, well, I guess I better run on the treadmill too. So, and of course, in order to run on a treadmill when you're in space, you have to put on a harness and bungee cords to hold you down, because if you're floating, it's pretty hard to run on the treadmill. So I did that for about 20 minutes, and then when I released the bungees and floated up, I realized, all that time I was running on the treadmill, I felt like I was back on Earth. I don't need this. I'm going to be on Earth for the rest of my life. And that's the last time I ever exercised in space, which you can get away with for 2 weeks. But if you're up on the space station for 6 months and you don't do any exercise, you're going to turn into a jellyfish. It's like lying in bed for 6 months. Your muscles deteriorate, your bones lose calcium. And that's been a huge research project for NASA for many years, to develop exercise equipment which is good enough that astronauts can preserve their bone and their muscle. And finally, we have it. It's called the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device. It can simulate weightlifting. Obviously, trying to lift weights in space isn't going to do very much good for you, right? But with a combination of pneumatics and motors and things, it really works. We're getting astronauts coming back now from 6 months in space with more muscle mass than they went up with, because they're exercising 2 to 3 hours a day, and you have to do that. It's a tremendous, impact on time, because when you think of the value of an astronaut's time in space, having to spend 2 to 3 hours exercising. The problem for a trip to Mars, it's a huge piece of equipment. It weighs a lot. It's got a big volume. It probably isn't going to fit in any sort of a spacecraft we're going to send in Mars. And NASA is still working hard to figure out, now that we know what sort of exercise keeps astronauts healthy, how can we miniaturize that so we could send it on long-duration space trips? The other big problem, radiation, long-term exposure to radiation, that's still a big problem, and there's various potential ways of addressing it, but right now I'd have to say it's still an unsolved problem.
Show of hands. How many people exercise 2 to 3 hours daily?
Good for you. I don't exercise that much, that's for sure. Oh no, his hand's up to ask a question, I think. But if you do exercise, congratulations.
Unfortunately, we have no more time for questions, but as I said, you can meet Drs. Neal and Hoffman outside at the reception. Let's thank them again for a really wonderful event.